On the morning of January 27th, 2017, the defendant, Timothy Verrill, a paranoid drug dealer trying to protect himself, his business, and his boss, brutally murdered Christine Sullivan and Jenna Pellegrini at 979 Meterborough Road in Farmington. The defendant struck both women in the head multiple times. He stabbed Christine 8 times in the neck and chest. He stabbed Jenna 43 times in the neck, chest, and back. He murdered Christine in the porch area of the house. Christine tried to defend herself, but she was unsuccessful. The defendant murdered Jenna while she was in bed, likely sleeping or unconscious. And after committing these murders, the defendant took disorganized steps to try to hide what he had done. He wrapped the bodies in various tarps and other coverings, and he discarded them like trash underneath the porch. A large pool of Christine's blood had frozen outside on the porch, so the defendant attempted to melt the ice using Prestone driveway heat ice melter. He also covered the icy blood with a small rug. The defendant also concealed a number of bloody items, as well as some of Jenna's personal belongings, in a black plastic and a clear plastic trash bag in the laundry room of the house. 979 Meterborough Road was the home of Dean Smaronk, the on-again but mostly off-again boyfriend of Christine Sullivan. Christine lived there too. Dean and Christine were drug dealers, and the defendant worked for them. In fact, the defendant would sometimes take over business when Dean and Christine went away, such as when they would go down to Florida. In January of 2017, the defendant had started acting strange. He was using a variety of drugs. He grew distant and paranoid, at times not even seeming to be aware of what was going on around him. Friends were so concerned that they tried to get the defendant to see a doctor. About a week before the murders, things seemed to have improved. A friend of the defendant's named Kathy Bradstreet gave the defendant a ride. During that ride, she noticed he seemed to be doing better. The defendant told Kathy that he had been doing too many drugs and that he had been having crazy thoughts, but that he had stopped doing everything. However, not long after that, if he had even ever truly stopped at all, the defendant began using drugs again: cocaine, crystal meth, and others. And he once again grew anxious, frantic, and emotional. Let's start by focusing on the end of January 2017. Early in the morning of January 25th, 2 days before the murders, Dean left his home in Farmington to travel to Florida, flying out of the Logan Airport in Boston. Dean had installed a surveillance system inside the house at 979 Meterborough Road, and you'll see video and images of Dean preparing to leave at about 3:50 that morning. Dean is the man circled in blue, and the man circled in orange there is Josh Caldwell, who at the time was a drug associate of Dean, Christine, and the defendants. You'll also see video and images from the Logan Airport showing Dean going through security at about 5:30 and boarding his plane at about 5:55 that morning. From January 25th until late on January 28th, Dean was in Florida. He stayed at an Allure Suites hotel where he produced a driver's license to identify himself. You're going to learn a little bit about cell phone technology in this trial, including how cell phone records can help establish the location of a particular cell phone, based on the cell towers that phone uses to make and receive calls and text messages. What you'll hear is that Dean's cell phone repeatedly used cell towers in and around Cape Coral, Florida, from January 26th through January 28th, including as he was talking to people back in New Hampshire and trying to reach out to Christine, who had stayed behind. On the evening of January 25th, back in New Hampshire, Christine came home with Jenna. In this image, Christine is the woman circled in purple, and Jenna is circled in green. Jenna was not a regular in this group, and many people associated with Dean and Christine, including the defendant, had never met Jenna before. Christine and Jenna got together that evening with a friend named Steve Clough. Steve was friends with Christine and Jenna and was also a drug associate of Dean and Christine's. The three of them had dinner. Christine had something of an antiques refurbishing side business, and Steve helped her bring a grandfather clock in from her car. On the next day, January 26th, Josh Caldwell and the defendant were out in Farmington. They saw Christine's car parked with a woman inside. Thinking the woman was Christine, Josh got into the car to say hello. He discovered that it wasn't Christine. The woman in the car was Jenna. The defendant stayed in his car. He didn't get out, and he didn't meet Jenna. Then the defendant and Josh went back to Josh's house, where the defendant stayed until the early evening. After leaving Josh's at about 10 p.m., the defendant texted Josh to say that he was heading to Dean's house. Not long after that, at about 11 p.m. on the 26th, the defendant arrived at Dean's home, where Christine and Jenna were present. It wasn't unusual for the defendant to be there. In fact, he had lived at 979 Meadowborough Road for some time before that. The defendant stayed at the house for a couple of hours, leaving at about 1 a.m. on January 27th. In this picture, you can see Christine, who's circled in purple, leading the defendant, circled in red, to the door. When the defendant left, he went back to Josh's house. Josh will tell you that when he saw the defendant in the early morning hours of January 27th, 2017, the defendant was acting strange. The defendant seemed paranoid and frantic. Josh had seen the defendant high on crystal meth before, and this was even worse than what Josh had seen in the past. Apparently concerned for the drug organization he was involved in, the defendant asked Josh if Josh thought Jenna might be an informant or someone who provides information to the police. The defendant expressed concern over whether Dean knew Jenna was at the house and what Jenna might be doing there. The defendant asked Josh if Josh thought the defendant should do something about it. In the end, the defendant told Josh he was going to go set up some cameras at Dean's house to see if he could figure out what was going on. And then the defendant left, fueled by his extreme paranoia. At about 2 a.m. on January 27th, the defendant arrived back at 979 Meadowborough Road. You will see during the course of this trial that no one else besides the defendant, Christine, and Jenna appear in any of the surveillance videos after 2 a.m. on that day. Not long after arriving, the defendant began taking scattered steps to hide different areas of the house from view. First, the defendant blocked the view of one of the security cameras in the house. Then, during the 4 a.m. hour, the defendant went back and forth between the house and the detached garage. You'll see that the defendant went back and forth between the house and the garage multiple times. Crime scene investigators would later find that all of the ground level windows in that garage had been covered in green spray paint. They would find in the laundry room of the house 2 used cans of green spray paint, each of them with the defendant's fingerprints on them. According to the surveillance videos, in the early morning hours of January 27th, Christine was wearing what appears to be a cowl neck sweater, lighter colored pants, and has on a noticeable pendant necklace. You'll hear that cell phone records of Christine's phone show that she placed a call to Dean at 1:47 a.m. The 2 of them spoke for about 15 minutes. That was the last outgoing communication from Christine's phone. Jenna was apparently in and out of bed in the morning of the 27th. She took some selfies from bed between 4 and 5 a.m., and the security cameras showed she was doing laundry at about 6:40 in the morning. The videos show that at that time, Jenna was wearing a darker colored hoodie over a lighter hoodie with some writing on it. The selfies show that lighter hoodie had pink strings on it, and it was over a shirt with a small floral print on it. Jenna would soon be murdered in that exact spot. The last video captured by the 979 Meterborough Road surveillance system on January 27th shows only the defendant. At about 6:57 a.m., the defendant quickly walked to the door and locked it. He was wearing a white trucker-style hat, a flannel shirt, and carrying his shoes in his hand. There are no more videos from the 27th. The defendant walked off camera in the direction of the security system controls, and then the system went dead. The evidence will show that at this point, the only 3 people in that house were the defendant, Christine, and Jenna. At some point after locking that door, the defendant struck. The murders were disorganized and hyper. They weren't cold and calculated. They were emotional and they were passionate. The defendant struck Christine multiple times in the head with a blunt instrument. These were extremely forceful blows, which caused bleeding in her brain. One of the blows was so powerful that it caused extensive fracturing around a large part of Christine's skull. You'll hear that Christine was alive for these blows. The defendant also stabbed Christine 8 times in the neck and chest. He cut the carotid artery in her neck, penetrated both of her lungs, and pierced her heart through and through. you'll hear Christine was alive for at least some of those wounds. Christine tried to defend herself. She suffered broken and cut fingers in an attempt to ward off this vicious attack. But she wasn't successful. The chief medical examiner for the state of New Hampshire would later rule Christine's death a homicide, caused by multiple stab wounds with perforations of the lung and heart and blunt impact injuries of the head, causing complex skull fractures and bleeding and swelling of the brain. The attack on Christine likely took place in the outdoor porch area, as her blood would later be found in that location. The defendant murdered Jenna while she was in bed. There was no evidence that she tried to defend herself. She was likely sleeping or unconscious at the time. As with Christine, the defendant also struck Jenna in the head, causing fractures of the skull and brain bleeding, although not quite as extensive as what he had caused Christine. Jenna was alive for these blows. The defendant then stabbed Jenna to death, inflicting 43 stab wounds to her neck, chest, and back. He sliced her carotid artery and her jugular vein and pierced each of her lungs multiple times. Jenna also suffered multiple fractured ribs. You'll hear she was alive for at least some of those wounds. The chief medical examiner would later rule Jenna's death a homicide caused by multiple stab wounds with perforations of the left carotid artery and lungs. After murdering these women, the evidence will show the defendant tried to clean up the scene. His efforts were as disorganized and hyper as the killings themselves. He hid the bodies by wrapping them in bedding, drop cloths, and a frayed tarp. The tarp left blue strings in Jenna's room and throughout the house. He then discarded the bodies under the porch, piling junk on top of them as if they were trash. You'll see and hear that beneath this bench, wrapped in those tarps and other coverings, investigators discovered the bodies of Christine Sullivan and Jenna Pellegrini. After committing the murders, the defendant returned to Josh Caldwell's house sometime around 11 a.m. or noon on January 27th. When the defendant arrived at Josh's, he grabbed a beer out of his car and went inside. Josh will tell you that when the defendant walked past him to enter the house, he said to Josh, "Interesting night." The defendant was behaving strangely and smelled strongly of body odor. He was wearing only a t-shirt, not the flannel shirt that he had on previously. Continuing with his strange behavior, the defendant asked Josh for a change of pants, which Josh provided and which the defendant then changed into right there on the spot. In addition to the beer he had taken from his car, the defendant began drinking shot after shot of alcohol, about 3 or 4 shots in all. Josh will tell you that the defendant was just staring off into the distance as he was doing this. Concerned that the defendant might have done something more than just set up cameras at Dean's house, Josh told the defendant that Dean would be pissed if the defendant had gone up there and done something stupid. To which the defendant's reply was to ask in a surprised tone, "Really?" Not long after, the defendant left Josh's house. As the defendant left, he told Josh he had to go tie up some loose ends. Sometime after leaving Josh's, you'll see the defendant went to make some purchases. He first went to the Walmart in Rochester, where he purchased a prepaid phone card. Then the defendant went to the Lowe's in Rochester. A significant amount of Christine's blood had frozen on the porch next to a hot tub, and he needed to melt the ice. At Lowe's, the defendant purchased 2 bags of solar salt, 2 containers of Prestone driveway heat ice melter, and a 2-quart bottle of ammonia cleaner. Investigators would later find a blood stain next to the hot tub underneath a purple rug. DNA testing would confirm the blood on that rug was Christine's. The blood stain was covered in what appeared to be ice melter. And just inside the door, investigators found a nearly empty container of pressed stone driveway heat. That container had only the defendant's fingerprints on it, no one else's, including one of his fingerprints on the cap. A second container of pressed stone driveway heat would later be found in the defendant's car, along with an open and partially used bottle of ammonia cleaner. While cleaning up the scene, the defendant also concealed a number of items in a couple of trash bags which he left in the laundry room of the house. In that laundry room, investigators would find a clear plastic trash bag containing a number of blood-stained items. DNA testing would confirm the blood on those items was Christine's. That clear plastic trash bag had the defendant's fingerprints on it. No one else's prints were on that bag. In the black plastic trash bag, also found in the laundry room, investigators would discover multiple blood-stained items, including a sheet that was soaked with what DNA testing would later confirm was Jenna's blood. Many of Jenna's personal belongings were also in this trash bag. This bag had the defendant's fingerprints on it. No one else's prints were on that bag. In a back bedroom on the main floor of the house, investigators found an unmade bed with a large blood stain on the bare mattress. There was a small rug lying next to the mattress. DNA testing would confirm that blood was Jenna's. Investigators would ultimately find the wrapped bodies of the two women in the junk heap outside where the defendant had left them. You'll see that when their bodies were found, both women were wearing the clothes they can be seen wearing in those videos from early in the morning of January 27th. Christine in a cowl neck sweater, light-colored pants, and the pendant necklace, and Jenna in a darker hoodie over a lighter hoodie, which was over a floral printed tank top. Next to the junk heap, where the defendant hid the women's bodies, there was a bucket with some bloody paper towels and a pail with a white trucker-style hat stained with blood. The evidence will show that this was the hat the defendant was wearing in that final surveillance video from January 27th. DNA testing confirmed that both Christine and the defendant's DNA were on that hat. While the defendant was cleaning up from the murders, Dean was attempting to get in touch with Christine. Between about 10:50 in the morning and 12:12 in the afternoon on the 27th, Dean called and texted Christine's cell phone, but she didn't answer his calls. She didn't respond to his text messages. All of these calls and texts use cell towers in and around Cape Coral, Florida. Another individual named Jason Parker was at the same time trying to get in touch with Christine. She didn't respond to his calls. She didn't answer his text messages. Kathy Bradstreet also tried to get in touch with Christine, to no avail. Later that afternoon, still on the 27th, Josh drove past Dean's house to see if anything was going on. When he did, he saw the defendant's car parked up close to the house, where Christine would usually park. Josh decided that he had to let Dean know something was up, so he reached out to Dean. "How bad is the news?" asked Dean. 10, said Josh. "Oi," replied Dean. Josh told Dean he needed to come back from Florida. Josh knew that if something bad had happened in that house, the police needed to get involved. But Josh didn't want to be the one to call the police, knowing that Dean might have drugs in the house. In response, Dean reached out to the defendant to check the house. But the defendant claimed the house was locked up tight. He also told Dean Christine's car was there, and that it was locked too. The next day, on January 28th, Dean asked some other people to check the house for Christine. He still had not heard from her. The first was Jason Parker, who went to the house around noon. Nobody answered the doors when Jason arrived. He went in the garage, and he saw the painted windows. He cleared the ice off the porch by the driveway, and he went up to the enclosed three-season porch on the main floor. He didn't go into the house itself. Later that same afternoon, the 28th, Kathy Bradstreet was trying to reach the defendant. She was concerned about her friend Christine because they had plans for that weekend, and Christine wasn't answering her. But Kathy wasn't immediately able to get a hold of the defendant because the defendant had gotten a new phone. You'll see records and video from the Sprint store in Dover showing that on January 28th, the defendant and his girlfriend purchased a new phone. Kathy eventually learned of the defendant's new number, and she was able to reach him. When she spoke to him, the defendant told Kathy that he had gotten a new phone because he was tired of his old life. He needed a break, and he threw his old phone away. The defendant told Kathy he had been to Dean's house twice. Once he wasn't able to get in, and one time he got in, got freaked out, and he left. But you'll see that the defendant didn't seem as concerned about Christine as others did. On the afternoon of the 28th, when Dean, Kathy, and others were trying to figure out where Christine was, the defendant was shopping, buying new boots, shoes, and other clothes, first at Red's Shoe Barn and then at Target. Later that afternoon, still looking for Christine, Dean called Steve Clough and asked him to go check the house. Steve went to the house with two other people, Buddy Seymour and Nicole Stedman. Nicole stayed in the car, but Buddy and Steve went to check things out. Steve saw that Christine's car was there, parked behind the house. They checked the garage, and Steve saw the painted windows. They checked around the outside of the house, but at first were unable to get inside. At some point, Steve called Dean, and Dean authorized him to break into the house and check inside. Steve and Buddy went up to that three-season porch, and Buddy used a shovel to pry open the sliding glass door that led from the porch into the kitchen. Investigators would later find one of Buddy's fingerprints on the handle of that shovel. The digging part of that shovel was stained with Christine's blood. After entering the house, Steve and Buddy eventually made their way to the bedroom where Jenna had been staying. They saw that the mattress was bare except for a rug. When they lifted the rug, they saw a large blood stain underneath it. They then left the house, but not before taking some drugs and drug paraphernalia that had been laying out. Based on what he was hearing from back in New Hampshire, Dean had bought a plane ticket home from Florida. At about 8:40, Dean boarded the plane in Florida, headed for the Logan Airport in Boston. While Dean was on his way back from Florida, the defendant was out with some friends. He then called his mother, Suzanne, to come pick him up and asked her to take him to rehab. Suzanne will tell you that the defendant seemed hyper and emotional and that she was frightened for him. She took him to the Wentworth Douglas Hospital emergency room to try to get him some help. While there, she heard the defendant tell hospital staff that he had been using cocaine, meth, and some other drugs. Dean arrived back at the Logan Airport at about 11:38 p.m. on the 28th. He was picked up by Josh Caldwell, who brought Dean back to 979 Meterborough Road. They arrived at about 1 or 1:30 in the morning on the 29th. Josh helped Dean clear the house to make sure no one was inside. Dean and Josh saw the blood stain on the mattress, and then Josh left the house, taking some drugs with him when he left. A little while after that, Steve Clough arrived at the house in case Dean needed anything. Dean turned on the surveillance system, which captured him examining things in his laundry room that were different than when he had left. This clip shows a date and time of January 27th at 9:35 a.m. But what the forensic expert who analyzed the surveillance recorder will tell you is that when he turned on the device to analyze it, its internal clock was off. It was off by 1 day, 17 hours, and 18 minutes. If you add 1 day, 17 hours, and 18 minutes to 9:35 on January 27th, you get approximately 2:53 a.m. on January 29th, which you'll see is consistent with when Dean arrived home and was checking his house. In the clip, Dean is dressed in the same clothes he was wearing when he arrived back at the Logan Airport from Florida and when the police arrived later that night. That bottom image is taken from police body cam footage when they responded to Dean's 911 call. The man circled in orange is Steve Clough, who was still there with Dean when the police arrived. The forensic expert is not going to be able to tell you when the DVR's internal clock went wrong, but you'll see that other recovered videos have date and timestamps consistent with corroborating evidence, such as the defendant telling Josh he was going to Dean's house and the defendant being seen arriving a short time later. Dean called the police at about 3 a.m. on January 29th, 2017. After Dean called 911, the police arrived and began their investigation. They found the wrapped bodies of the women and the other items mentioned earlier. They also found out on the kitchen counter a number of cleaning products, including bleach, all-purpose cleaners, carpet cleaners, and air sanitizers. Police found traces of blue frayed tarp in Jenna's room and throughout the house. And as the police began to investigate, they identified the defendant as someone they wanted to talk to. On January 29th, a state police trooper called the defendant. At the time, the defendant was at his brother Jeff's house in Newton, New Hampshire. The defendant and his girlfriend had taken his girlfriend's car to Jeff's house. The defendant told the trooper he was willing to speak with investigators and gave the trooper his brother's address. But after he got off the phone, he told his brother he was going outside to wait for the police. And then he left in his girlfriend's car, leaving his girlfriend behind. But before driving away, the defendant removed his girlfriend's New Hampshire license plates and replaced them with his brother's roommate's Massachusetts plates. You're going to hear that in the following days, the defendant continued to act like someone who had just committed a life-altering act. Over the course of the state's presentation, you're going to hear from witnesses who used and sold drugs. Their attitudes towards the police are probably a lot different than yours are. It's not necessarily their first instinct to call the police when something suspicious has happened. They likely lied to the police when asked about their own drug use and drug sales. What we want to ask you to consider as you listen to those witnesses is that while witnesses may lie about their own drug use and their own drug sales in an interest of self-preservation, that same interest does not give them a reason to lie about what they knew about the murders of Christine and Jenna. In fact, the majority of the civilian witnesses the state will present to you were friends with Christine, Jenna, and/or the defendant. So we invite you, as we discussed with each of you in jury selection, to keep an open mind when you're listening to these witnesses. Look for how the scientific, video, photograph, cell phone, and other evidence corroborates the testimony of these witnesses. Pay attention to when a witness might have had that self-preservation motive to lie, versus when they were trying to make sure the police had the best information to use in their investigation into the murders of Christine and Jenna. Now, I imagine when I'm done speaking with you in a few minutes, defense is going to come up here and they're going to tell you that somebody else murdered Christine and Jenna. They may talk to you about untested evidence and may ask you to speculate. They're going to create a boogeyman, and they might even give that boogeyman a name. We don't know who that's going to be yet. And it's true that Dean and Christine had a terrible relationship. Dean was abusive, and he didn't hide the way he felt about Christine, often saying and texting horrible things about Christine to others. It was no secret among anyone acquainted with the two how Dean treated Christine. But on January 27th, 2017, Dean was in Florida. On January 28th, when Dean thought something was wrong in New Hampshire, he came back. And when Dean came back, he called the police. We're not going to make any excuses for Dean or the way that he treated Christine. But the evidence will show that when he thought something had happened to Christine, he didn't run. He wanted law enforcement to investigate. They did investigate. And by the end of this trial, you are going to see that the evidence they gathered conclusively shows the following things. When the defendant locked the door to 979 Meadowborough Road at 6:57 a.m. on January 27th, the only three people in that house were the defendant, Christine, and Jenna. Christine and Jenna were killed in the clothes they were wearing during those videos in the early morning hours of January 27th. Christine was savagely beaten in the head and stabbed 8 times. Jenna was beaten in the head and stabbed 43 times. And after he murdered them, the defendant concealed their bodies by wrapping them up and piling junk on top of them like trash. Hours after the murders, the defendant purchased 2 containers of Prestone driveway heat ice melt, which was later found poured over Christine's frozen bloodstain, a near-empty container with the defendant's fingerprints on it, no one else's, found nearby. The second container found in his car. Objects stained with Christine's blood were concealed in a clear plastic trash bag with the defendant's fingerprints on it, no one else's. Jenna's personal belongings and a sheet stained with her blood were concealed in a black plastic trash bag with the defendant's fingerprints on it, no one else's. And then, when the police wanted to talk to the defendant, he swapped out the license plates on his girlfriend's car and he fled. There is no boogeyman. The evidence in this case will show that the defendant is the only one who cleaned up the scene, the only one who fled from the police, and the only one who killed. And at the end of this trial, we'll ask you to return a verdict consistent with that evidence. Guilty. Thank you.